The Jacksons had been living in Sunnyside Estates for exactly 3 months and 4 days when the incident that would upend their lives occurred. Robert, a software engineer who'd recently been promoted to team lead, and Michelle, a pediatric physical therapist who'd scaled back to part-time after the move, had scrimped and saved for years to afford this slice of suburban paradise. Their twin 7-year-olds, Zoe with her wild curls and perpetually skinned knees, and Max with his serious eyes and collection of dinosaur facts, had never had a backyard before, let alone access to a community pool with a twisting water slide and shallow splash zone. The family's Tudor-style home on Magnolia Lane needed work. The previous owners had installed an inexplicable amount of wood paneling, and the primary bathroom featured an alarming shade of salmon-colored tile. But it was theirs. More importantly, it was in the good school district, with sidewalks for bike riding and neighbors who organized things like 4th of July parades and holiday cookie exchanges. What the real estate agent had conveniently glossed over during the 3 frantic weekend house tours was Sunnyside Estates' reputation for having one of the most micromanaging HOAs in the county. The 47-page covenant they'd signed at closing, while simultaneously initialing mortgage documents and trying to keep the twins from dismantling the conference room, outlined everything from acceptable mailbox designs to the precise height of lawn grass, between 2.5 and 3.75 inches, no exceptions. It had also failed to mention Pamela Whitfield, a 58-year-old former corporate compliance officer who turned her considerable talents to neighborhood enforcement after an early retirement. From her meticulously maintained colonial directly facing the community pool, Pamela monitored the comings and goings of Sunnyside with the dedication of someone operating a military surveillance outpost in hostile territory. Her bay window, flanked by starched gingham curtains, provided an unobstructed view of the pool area, the playground, and the main entrance to the clubhouse, all the better to document infractions with her arsenal of digital cameras with telephoto lenses. The Jacksons had already received 2 official notices in their short tenure, one for placing their trash bins at the curb at 5:45 p.m. instead of after 6:00 p.m. on collection eve, and another for the chalk hopscotch grid Zoe had drawn on their own driveway, which apparently violated the prohibition against non-permanent decorative elements visible from the common thoroughfare. Robert had crumpled the notices. Michelle had smoothed them out and filed them away, just in case. Neither had connected these paper warnings to the white-haired woman who frequently adjusted her binoculars when they walked by with the kids. They were about to learn exactly who ran Sunnyside Estates, and it wasn't the 5-member board that met monthly in the beige-walled community center. The 3rd Saturday in July broke temperature records across the state. By 10 a.m., the asphalt was shimmering and neighborhood lawns, all cut to regulation height, were wilting despite automated sprinkler systems. The community pool had reached capacity by noon, families claiming every chaise lounge and patch of concrete with beach towels, coolers, and the distinctive scent of competing sunscreens. Michelle had managed to secure a spot under one of the coveted umbrellas by arriving just as the lifeguard unlocked the gates. The twins, vibrating with excitement, had cannonballed into the water seconds after passing the mandatory shower station, leaving her to arrange their belongings while fielding a work call about a patient's therapy schedule. Max had recently graduated from swim lessons at the YMCA and had abandoned his Finding Nemo floaties, a development that filled him with 7-year-old pride and his mother with low-grade anxiety. He'd been practicing his underwater flips all morning, emerging with chlorine-reddened eyes and increasingly crooked swim trunks that Michelle had to readjust every few minutes. "Mom, watch this," he called for the dozenth time, as Michelle looked up from applying another layer of sunscreen to Zoe's shoulders. Max executed a wobbly somersault in the 3-foot section, his navy blue trunks sliding down to reveal about 2 inches of his small bottom before he surfaced, sputtering and grinning. "Great job, buddy," Michelle called, already moving toward him with a towel. "Let's fix your shorts, okay? And maybe take a little break for some water and fruit." She quickly tugged his sagging waistband back into position, performing the universal maternal maneuver of discreetly adjusting children's clothing while scanning to see if anyone had noticed. No one had, or at least, no one who mattered. The lifeguard was focused on some teenagers diving for rings. Nearby parents were engrossed in their own children or their phones. A toddler was having a meltdown over a melting popsicle 3 chairs over, drawing most of the poolside attention. Only one person had noticed, and she wasn't merely watching. She was documenting. From her vantage point on her second-floor deck, Pamela Whitfield adjusted the zoom on her Canon PowerShot, her mouth set in a thin line of righteous indignation. This was exactly the sort of moral decline she'd warned Walter Chen about at the last board meeting. First, children's buttocks at the pool. Next, it would be teens skinny dipping after hours, and God knows what else. She had cataloged 17 violations of the pool code already this season, including 3 instances of glass containers and an unauthorized pool noodle that exceeded the 48-inch maximum length. This, however, was her first indecent exposure incident, and it required immediate escalation. Pamela didn't bother calling the non-emergency line. This was clearly an emergency. Children were being exposed to nudity, for heaven's sake. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher answered, her voice calm and professional. This is Pamela Whitfield, 347 Magnolia Lane in Sunnyside Estates, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. I need to report inappropriate exposure of minors at our community pool. There are children. Her voice dropped to a scandalized whisper, without proper coverage of their private areas, in full view of everyone. It's disgraceful, and I have photographic evidence. The dispatcher, to her credit, asked several clarifying questions, none of which dampened Pamela's certainty that this situation required immediate law enforcement intervention. Yes, there were adults present. No, no one seemed to be in distress. Yes, the children were with their parents. No, she couldn't speak to the parents herself because she was observing from her home. Yes, she understood that emergency services were for life-threatening situations. If you won't send someone immediately, I'll call Chief Patterson directly, Pamela finally stated, invoking the name of the police chief she'd met at a community fundraiser 3 years prior and with whom she'd taken a single photograph. This is about the safety of children. 28 minutes later, as Max and Zoe were sharing a bag of grapes and arguing about whose turn it was to use the inflatable shark, Officers Ramirez and Jackson stepped through the pool gate, their dark uniforms and utility belts starkly out of place among the beach towels and pool floats. The reaction was immediate. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Parents instinctively moved closer to their children. The lifeguard stood up straighter on his elevated chair. Even the pool's filtration system seemed to grow quieter, as if the water itself was holding its breath. Officer Ramirez, a veteran with 17 years on the force and a father of 4, scanned the scene with practiced efficiency. There were approximately 30 people at the pool, a dozen adults, a handful of teenagers, and about 15 children of various ages. No one appeared to be in distress. No one was undressed. There was no visible emergency of any kind, just a typical Saturday at a community pool suddenly frozen in awkward tableau. His partner, Officer Jackson, no relation to the family, was newer to the force and visibly uncomfortable. She joined the department to work on community outreach and youth violence prevention. Responding to calls about children's swimwear wasn't exactly what she'd had in mind when she'd enrolled in the academy. "Good afternoon," Officer Ramirez announced to the pool area generally. "Sorry to interrupt your Saturday. We received a call about a possible situation involving appropriate swimwear for minors. We just need to check it out." Michelle, who had been helping Max adjust his shark goggles, felt her stomach drop. Somehow, mother's intuition, perhaps, she knew instantly that this involved her children. She'd noticed Pamela Whitfield watching from her deck earlier, but had dismissed it as the idle curiosity of a retiree with nothing better to do. "Officers," she said, stepping forward while keeping one hand firmly on each twin's shoulder. "I think this might involve my children. I'm Michelle Jackson. These are my twins, Max and Zoe." The children looked up at the officers with wide eyes. Max's lower lip began to tremble slightly. He'd recently watched a television program about police officers rescuing people, and in his 7-year-old mind, their presence meant something very serious had occurred. Officer Jackson knelt down to the children's eye level. "Hey there. I like your shark goggles," she said to Max, who managed a weak smile. "We just need to talk to your mom for a minute, okay? Nothing to worry about." Michelle guided the twins to a nearby chaise lounge. "Sit here and finish your grapes. I'll be right over there talking to the officers." As she stepped aside with the police, she could feel the eyes of every parent at the pool. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, a few judgmental. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly self-conscious in her own modest one piece. "Mrs. Jackson," Officer Ramirez began, his voice low, "we received a call from a neighbor reporting inappropriate nudity involving children at this pool." The caller specifically mentioned a young boy who was allegedly swimming without proper coverage. Michelle's face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and dawning anger. "Are you serious? Max's swim trunks slipped down a bit when he was doing underwater somersaults. I fixed them immediately. It was literally for a few seconds, and it was just the top of his bottom. He's 7 years old, for goodness sake." "I understand," Officer Ramirez said, and his tone suggested he truly did. "We have to respond to all calls involving minors, but—" he glanced around the pool area, then back at his partner. Something passed between them, the silent communication of colleagues who'd seen their fair share of frivolous calls. The caller also mentioned having photographs. Officer Jackson added, her expression troubled. "Photographs." Michelle's voice rose enough that several nearby parents turned to look. Someone was taking pictures of my son. From the corner of her eye, she spotted movement on Pamela Whitfield's deck. The older woman wasn't even attempting to be subtle now. She stood at the railing, phone in hand, watching the interaction with the police. "It's her," Michelle said, pointing toward the house. "Pamela Whitfield. She's been watching us since we arrived, and apparently she's been photographing my children without permission." Officer Ramirez followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "We're familiar with Ms. Whitfield," he said carefully. "This is the third call from that address this week." "Third call about what?" Michelle demanded. "I'm not at liberty to discuss other calls," he replied professionally. "But I can tell you that based on what we're seeing here, there's absolutely no issue with your children's attire or behavior. We'll be having a separate conversation about misuse of emergency services and potentially about inappropriate photography of minors without parental consent." As the officers prepared to leave, a woman with salt and pepper hair pulled into a practical bun approached them. Michelle recognized her as Dr. Eleanor Rodriguez, a retired family court judge who lived in the limestone house at the end of Magnolia Lane. Though they'd never formally met, Eleanor had a reputation for being both fair-minded and formidable. "Officers," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to being in charge of a courtroom. "I've witnessed this entire situation, as well as Ms. Whitfield's inappropriate surveillance. I'd like to provide a statement." As Eleanor spoke with the police, other parents began to gather around Michelle. Susan Miller, whose daughter was in the same day camp group as the twins, squeezed her arm supportively. "Pamela called animal control when our retriever barked at a squirrel," she confided, "and she reported the Thompsons when their holiday lights were still up on January 3rd. This has been going on for years." By the time the officers left, promising to follow up with Pamela directly, Michelle was surrounded by a dozen neighbors, all with their own stories of Pamela's aggressive monitoring and reporting. What had begun as one of the most mortifying moments of her parenting life had somehow transformed into an impromptu support group. As the twins splashed happily in the pool, unaware of the adult drama, Michelle found herself at the center of what was rapidly becoming a neighborhood revolution. By Sunday morning, Michelle's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Word of the pool incident had spread through every social channel in Sunnyside Estates, the official Facebook group, the unofficial mom's text chain, even the Nextdoor app where discussions usually centered around lost pets and recommendations for reliable plumbers. Robert, who'd been at a work retreat during the pool confrontation, was incensed. "She took pictures of our son, without permission, and then called 911. That's not just ridiculous, Michelle, it's potentially criminal." Michelle sat at their kitchen island, scrolling through messages of support mixed with thinly veiled curiosity. The officers said they'd handle it. But that's not even the worst part. This morning, I had an email from Walter Chen. Walter, the perpetually overwhelmed HOA board president who worked full-time as an accountant, had sent a community-wide message at 6:42 a.m. Dear valued Sunnyside residents, it has come to the board's attention that there have been concerns regarding appropriate attire and behavior at community facilities. In light of these concerns, we are calling an emergency meeting on Tuesday at 7:00 p.m. to discuss pool regulations and enforcement procedures. All residents are encouraged to attend this important discussion about maintaining the standards and values that make Sunnyside Estates a premier community. Sincerely, Walter Chen, OA Board President. He doesn't even mention what happened, Michelle fumed. It sounds like I let the kids run around naked or something. And values? What values are we talking about? The right to privacy. The right not to have some neighbor creating a photographic record of your children's wardrobe malfunctions. Robert was already crafting an email of his own. As a systems engineer, his approach to conflict tended toward the methodical. Define the problem, identify stakeholders, propose solutions, implement change. We need legal advice, he said, not looking up from his laptop. There are laws about photographing minors, about misuse of emergency services, about harassment. The twins, mercifully oblivious to the adult concerns swirling around them, were in the backyard attempting to create a water slide using a tarp, the garden hose, and what appeared to be an alarming amount of dish soap. Through the kitchen window, Michelle watched them laughing, their faces bright with simple joy. Something clenched in her chest, the fierce, protective love that had overwhelmed her from the moment they were placed in her arms 7 years ago. They shouldn't have to worry about this, she said quietly, about being watched or judged, or having innocent childhood moments turned into some kind of. I don't even know what Pamela thinks she saw. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. On the front step stood Eleanor Rodriguez, impeccably dressed despite the heat in linen pants and a crisp blouse. In her hands was a bakery box from Marzipan, the fancy patisserie downtown that made birthday cakes costing as much as a small appliance. I thought you might need something sweet after yesterday, Eleanor said, handing over the box. Chocolate eclairs, my late husband's cure for all neighborhood feuds. Michelle invited her in, hastily clearing away the breakfast dishes while Robert made fresh coffee. Eleanor settled at the kitchen island with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in any room. I've lived in Sunnyside for 27 years, she began without preamble. I've seen 6 HOA presidents, 3 major covenant revisions, and more petty squabbles than I ever saw in my courtroom. But what's happening with Pamela Whitfield has crossed a line. She sipped her coffee. This isn't her first inappropriate surveillance incident. 2 summers ago, she reported the Diaz family's teenage daughter for inappropriate swimwear because their 16-year-old was wearing a perfectly normal bikini. Last year, she called the city inspector on Henry Williams. You know, the retired Marine on Oak Street, because his wheelchair ramp allegedly extended 3 inches too far into the setback zone. Why does everyone put up with it? Robert asked, the engineer in him genuinely puzzled by the inefficiency of allowing one person to create so much community friction. Eleanor's smile was wry. Fear of becoming the next target. Complacency. The fact that most people are too busy working and raising families to attend board meetings or vote in HOA elections. Pamela hasn't missed a meeting in 15 years. She runs the Architectural Review Committee, the Pool Committee, and the Holiday Decorating Committee. She's not on the board only because she's made too many enemies to win an election. So what do we do? Michelle asked, glancing again at the children in the backyard, now covered in suds and shrieking with laughter. Eleanor straightened, and Michelle caught a glimpse of the judge she must have been, commanding, incisive, unwilling to suffer fools. You attend Tuesday's meeting. You bring every parent who witnessed yesterday's fiasco. You demand action, not just about the pool incident, but about the systemic issues. And her eyes took on a determined gleam. You let me help you prepare. By the time Eleanor left 2 hours later, they had a strategy, a list of applicable HOA bylaw sections, state statutes regarding privacy and photography, and the beginnings of what Robert, with his tech background, had termed a comprehensive community safety and harassment mitigation protocol. The twins, exhausted from their backyard water adventures, were napping upstairs. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of a lawnmower and the rhythmic ticking of the vintage wall clock they'd found at an estate sale. "Do you think we're overreacting?" Michelle asked suddenly, doubt creeping in as she reviewed their meeting notes. "It's just, everyone will be there. Everyone will be talking about our kids, about me. Maybe we should just let it go. Avoid the pool when she's watching. Take the kids to the lake instead." Robert looked up from his laptop, his expression unusually fierce for a man who typically approached conflict with the calm detachment of someone troubleshooting a software bug. "No," he said firmly, "that's exactly what she wants, for people to modify their perfectly normal behavior because they're afraid of her scrutiny. This isn't just about the kids' swimsuits slipping. It's about creating a community where people aren't afraid to let their children play, where everyone feels welcome at facilities they pay for through their dues, where one person's distorted sense of propriety doesn't dictate everyone else's quality of life." Michelle felt something settle in her chest, resolve replacing the mixture of embarrassment and anger she'd been carrying since seeing those officers walk through the pool gate. "You're right," she said, reaching for her phone. "I'm going to start making calls." The Sunnyside Estates Community Center had never seen attendance like this, not for the contentious vote on increasing dues to add pickleball courts, not even for the legendary 2018 showdown over permitted holiday lighting color temperatures. Warm white had prevailed over bright white, much to Pamela's chagrin. Every folding chair was occupied. Residents lined the walls, sat cross-legged on the industrial carpet, and clustered in the doorway. The small room, usually occupied by no more than 20 people for HOA meetings, now held at least 75. The ancient air conditioning system wheezed ineffectually against the combined body heat. Walter Chin, a man whose greatest desire in life was that meetings should start and end on time with minimal interpersonal conflict, surveyed the crowd with poorly concealed dismay. His co-board members looked equally apprehensive. Treasurer Diane Hartford clutched her financial reports like a shield. Maintenance Director Frank Peters tugged nervously at his collar. Secretary Alicia Watkins typed frantically on her tablet, presumably documenting the unprecedented attendance. An architectural review liaison, Thomas Berry, studied the ceiling tiles with sudden interest. At exactly 7:00 p.m., Walter cleared his throat and tapped the microphone, producing a feedback screech that momentarily silenced the room. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this special meeting of the Sunnyside Estates Homeowners Association Board. As noted in the email, we're here to discuss pool regulations and community standards." From her seat in the second row, between Robert and Eleanor, Michelle could see Pamela Whitfield in her usual spot, front row center, a bulging 3-ring binder on her lap, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to stretch her features into a perpetual expression of disapproval. She wore a navy blazer despite the heat, as if attending a business meeting rather than a neighborhood discussion. "Before we begin," Walter continued, "I want to remind everyone of our meeting procedures. Each resident will have 2 minutes to speak. Please be respectful and—" "Point of order," Pamela interrupted, not bothering to wait for acknowledgement before standing. "As the resident who raised the initial concern, I believe I should be allowed to present my documentation first, before open comments." Walter blinked rapidly, his authority already slipping away. "I suppose that would be." Actually, Eleanor's clear voice cut through the murmurs. According to the bylaws, Article VII, Section 4, regular order of business at special meetings includes board presentation of the agenda item first, followed by open comments from residents in the order in which they signed the speaker list. She held up a copy of the bylaws, specific sections highlighted in neon yellow. "I believe the sign-in sheet has been circulating since 6:45 p.m. A rustle went through the crowd, equal parts appreciation for Eleanor's procedural knowledge and anticipation of the conflict brewing. Walter looked momentarily relieved to have a clear process to follow. "Yes, thank you, Eleanor. As she correctly stated, we'll begin with a brief overview, then proceed to resident comments." He shuffled his papers. The board called this meeting in response to concerns about appropriate behavior at the community pool. We want to ensure that our shared spaces remain comfortable and suitable for all residents while respecting individual rights and reasonable expectations of privacy. Mattel noticed he carefully avoided any mention of specific incidents or individuals, a small mercy for which she was grateful. With that introduction, we'll now open the floor to comments. First on our list is Pamela Whitfield. Pamela approached the small podium with the determination of a prosecutor delivering an opening statement. She placed her binder on the lectern and adjusted her reading glasses. Fellow residents, what I'm about to share may be disturbing, but it's necessary for the safety of our community. For too long, certain standards have been allowed to slip at our pool facility. She opened her binder and removed a stack of papers. I've documented 17 violations of pool rules this season alone, ranging from food in the water to unauthorized flotation devices. But what occurred this past Saturday crosses the line from mere rule-breaking to truly inappropriate behavior. With theatrical gravity, she held up a printout. Though Michelle couldn't see the image clearly from her seat, her stomach clenched with the knowledge that it was likely a zoomed-in photo of her son's momentarily exposed bottom. Children. Pamela pronounced the word with emphasis, swimming in various states of undress, in full view of everyone present. I've taken the liberty of circling the areas of concern. A collective gasp went through the room, not at whatever was shown in the image, but at the revelation that Pamela had been photographing children at the pool without permission. Robert surged to his feet, his face flushed. "That's my son in that picture," he said, his voice shaking with controlled fury. A 7-year-old child whose swim trunks slipped for a few seconds while he was playing. What gives you the right to photograph him without our consent? To maintain some kind of surveillance operation on children? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Pamela seemed genuinely surprised by the reaction. "I was documenting a violation," she said defensively, "for the good of the community. By creating what is essentially unauthorized photography of minors." This came from Susan Miller, standing up from her seat across the aisle. "My daughter was at that pool on Saturday. Did you take pictures of her too? Do you have some kind of database of our children?" Walter, clearly sensing the meeting spiraling beyond his control, attempted to intervene. "Let's stay focused on the pool regulations themselves." "No," Michelle said, finding her voice as she stood. "This isn't about pool rules. This is about one resident appointing herself as the community surveillance system, about our children being watched, photographed, and reported to authorities for normal childhood activities, about police being called to our community pool for a non-emergency, frightening our kids and creating a hostile environment." Emboldened by the nodding heads around her, she continued, "I've lived here for only a few months, but in that time, my family has received written warnings about chalk drawings on our own driveway and the time of day we put out our trash cans. At first, I thought these were just overzealous rule enforcement. Now I realize it's part of a pattern of harassment and intimidation that apparently has been going on for years." The floodgates opened. One by one, residents rose to share their experiences. Greg Thompson, whose son with autism had been reported for excessive noise while stimming at the playground. Maria Diaz, whose teenage daughter had been body-shamed for her swimwear. Henry Williams, the retired Marine who'd nearly lost his accessibility ramp. The Paddles, who'd been cited for offensive cooking odors emanating from their home. Through it all, Pamela sat rigidly, her expression oscillating between indignation and disbelief as the community she'd appointed herself to protect turned against her. When the testimonials finally subsided, Eleanor stood, the room quieted in anticipation. "I've lived in Sunnyside Estates for nearly 3 decades," she began. "I've seen neighborhoods thrive when they function as true communities, places where people look out for each other, yes, but also where they respect boundaries, privacy, and the simple joy of everyday life. What we have witnessed evolving here isn't vigilance. It's vigilantism. It isn't protection. It's persecution." She turned to face the board directly. "As a former judge, I can tell you that what's been described tonight raises serious legal concerns. Potential harassment, invasion of privacy, unauthorized photography of minors, misuse of emergency services. As your neighbor, I can tell you it raises even more serious community concerns. Eleanor produced a document from her leather portfolio. I've drafted a proposed amendment to our covenant that would address these issues directly. It includes provisions for a clear complaint process that requires documentation and good faith efforts at resolution before board involvement, explicit prohibition of surveillance activities and unauthorized photography in common areas, consequences for demonstrably frivolous complaints or misuse of official channels, and the creation of a community ombudsperson position to mediate disputes before they escalate. She handed copies to each board member. I move that the board review this proposal and call a vote at next month's meeting. The silence that followed was broken by Thomas Berry, the normally reticent board member who handled architectural reviews. I'll second that motion, he said quietly, and I move that until this amendment can be properly reviewed and voted upon, all pending complaints filed by any resident with more than 3 prior complaints this calendar year be suspended. Walter, looking simultaneously overwhelmed and relieved, called for a show of hands. The motion passed unanimously, to thunderous applause. Pamela Whitfield, her binder clutched to her chest like armor, stood up and walked stiffly toward the exit. As she passed Michelle, she paused. I was only trying to maintain standards, she said, her voice barely audible over the continuing conversations. This neighborhood is going downhill. You'll see. Michelle met her gaze steadily. No, Pamela. What you'll see is a neighborhood becoming a community again. The day after the HOA meeting, Michelle woke to the cheerful chime of her phone signaling a text message. Then another, and another. By the time she shuffled into the kitchen to start the coffee, she had 17 unread messages. Most were from neighbors she'd barely known before last night, offering support and sharing relief at the meeting's outcome. Susan Miller had created a new text group called Sunnyside Actual for residents to coordinate community building activities free from unreasonable scrutiny. The Paddles were organizing a multicultural potluck for the following weekend. Henry Williams offered to start a workshop teaching kids how to build birdhouses, sidewalk chalk, and messy activities encouraged. But the most surprising message came from Thomas Berry. Board emergency session last night after regular meeting. Walter stepping down as president, citing personal reasons, nominated me as interim. First act as president, dissolved all committees chaired by PO and implemented 60-day moratorium on violation reports while we revised processes. Thought you should know. Robert, reading over her shoulder while pouring coffee, let out a low whistle. That was fast. I didn't think HOAs could move quickly on anything. I guess when enough people finally speak up. Michelle began, but was interrupted by the twins thundering down the stairs, already arguing about whether sharks could defeat octopuses in an underwater battle. Later that morning, while the kids were at their summer day camp, Michelle drove to the community pool. She'd half expected to find it deserted after the drama, or perhaps to see Pamela on her deck with her camera at the ready. Instead, she found a handful of parents with toddlers in the shallow end, a group of retirees doing water aerobics in the lap lane, and no sign of surveillance from the Whitfield residents. As she spread her towel on a lounge chair, intending to enjoy a rare hour of solitude with her novel, Maria Diaz waved from the pool steps. We missed you at the last PTA meeting, Maria called, waiting over. I'm the vice president this year. We could use some new blood if you're interested. Michelle had been so focused on settling the twins into their new school before summer break that she'd missed most of the parent involvement opportunities. I'd like that, she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. By the time she left the pool, she'd agreed to join not only the PTA, but also a newly forming Community Standards Review group that Eleanor was organizing to help the board revise the covenant into something more family-friendly. Throughout the week, small changes rippled through Sunnyside Estates. The board sent out a revised pool policy that focused on safety rather than arbitrary restrictions. Children's laughter, once muffled by parents worried about noise complaints, rang freely from backyard trampolines and driveway basketball hoops. 3 families on Elm Street set up an impromptu water balloon station during a particularly scorching afternoon, something that would have previously triggered multiple violation reports. Not everyone was pleased with the shifting atmosphere. A small contingent of residents, mostly older homeowners who'd bought into Sunnyside specifically for its strict regulations, grumbled about declining standards. A few aligned themselves with Pamela, forming what Robert jokingly called the Preservation Society for Property Values and Proper Decorum. But they were the minority. For most residents, the post-meeting period felt like a community exhaling a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. The following Tuesday, as Michelle pulled into her driveway after picking up the twins from day camp, she noticed something unusual. Pamela Whitfield was in her front yard, not with a camera or clipboard, but with gardening gloves and pruning shears, tending to her immaculate roses. What was even more surprising was that Eleanor Rodriguez stood with her, the two women in what appeared to be civil, if not friendly, conversation. "Who's that lady talking to the scary camera lady?" Max asked from the backseat, proving that children absorbed far more than adults realized. "That's Judge Rodriguez," Michelle answered carefully. "And Mrs. Whitfield isn't scary. She's just very concerned about rules. She told Dad he couldn't park his car in front of our house." Zoe chimed in. "I heard you guys talking about it when you thought we were asleep." Michelle made a mental note to have more private conversations with Robert actually behind closed doors. "Well, there are going to be some changes in how our neighborhood handles rules," she explained as they climbed out of the car. "Everyone's going to try to be more understanding and talk to each other nicely about problems instead of just reporting them." As if on cue, Eleanor spotted them and waved, then said something to Pamela, who gave a stiff nod in their direction before returning to her roses. That evening, over a dinner of breakfast for dinner, the twins' favorite, Robert shared news from his daily run through the neighborhood. "They're taking down the old swing set at the playground," he reported, serving himself another waffle. Apparently, Thomas Berry got 3 different companies to bid on a complete renovation. "They're putting in adaptive equipment for kids with disabilities, a proper splash pad, and some kind of climbing structure that looks like a spaceship." "How are they paying for that?" Michelle asked. "I thought the reserve fund was barely covering the pool maintenance." Robert grinned. "Remember how Pamela blocked the board from raising dues for the last 5 years? Turns out she was sitting on nearly $200,000 in unused funds because she kept vetoing every improvement project as unnecessary expenditures." Thomas found the reserve study during his first day as interim president. The board voted unanimously last night to release the funds. Michelle shook her head in disbelief. "So all this time we couldn't get the playground updated or the clubhouse painted because one person was essentially hoarding the community's money?" "Pretty much." Diane Hartford, she's the treasurer, was almost in tears explaining how Pamela had intimidated her into maintaining unnecessarily high reserves for emergencies while blocking any actual spending. The twins, having lost interest in the adult conversation about finances, had moved on to debating whether putting syrup on scrambled eggs was delicious or disgusting. Max was conducting an experiment that suggested he fell firmly in the delicious camp. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Michelle sat on their back patio with a glass of wine, scrolling through the neighborhood's newly revitalized social media group. Residents were sharing ideas for community improvements, organizing volunteer days to help elderly neighbors with yard work, and planning a proper welcome committee for new homeowners, something the Jacksons certainly could have used 3 months ago. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Robert asked, joining her with his own glass. "I was just thinking about how differently this all could have gone," she replied. "If I just kept quiet at the pool, if we hadn't gone to that meeting, if Eleanor hadn't been there that day." Robert took her hand. "But you didn't keep quiet. That's what makes you such a great mom, and an even better community member. You stood up not just for our kids, but for everyone who's been intimidated into silence." Michelle squeezed his hand, grateful for his unwavering support. "It still feels surreal. 3 days ago, I was mortified about the police being called on our children. Now I'm on 3 different committees and have coffee scheduled with people I barely knew existed last week." "Welcome to suburban activism," Robert laughed. "1 minute you're worried about swim trunks. The next you're overthrowing an HOA dictator and rewriting community bylaws. The official resolution came 3 weeks later, at the regular monthly HOA meeting. The community center was still unusually full, though not quite at the standing room only capacity of the emergency session. The atmosphere was markedly different, less tension, more anticipation. Thomas Berry, settling into his role as interim president with surprising confidence, called the meeting to order promptly at 7:00 p.m. Before we get to tonight's main agenda items, I'd like to update everyone on the actions taken by the board since our special meeting. He began, his voice steady. First, as many of you know, Walter Chen has stepped down as president, citing personal reasons. What went unmentioned was Walter's palpable relief at relinquishing the position he'd never particularly wanted but had accepted because no one else would take it. Second, we've implemented a comprehensive review of all committees, their structures, and their authorities. As part of this review, we've temporarily suspended the activities of the Architectural Review, Pool Oversight, and Decorative Standards committees pending restructuring. A murmur of approval rippled through the audience. These had been Pamela's primary domains of influence, the committees through which she'd exercised most of her control over the neighborhood. Third, we've engaged legal counsel to review our covenant, bylaws, and enforcement procedures to ensure they comply with current state laws and best practices for homeowners associations. Eleanor, seated in the second row with a legal pad on her lap, nodded approvingly. And finally, we're ready to present for community discussion and subsequent vote a series of amendments drafted by our newly formed Community Standards Working Group, led by Eleanor Rodriguez. Thomas gestured to Eleanor, who approached the podium with the same commanding presence she'd once brought to her courtroom. At 72, she was proving to be an unexpected but formidable champion for community reform. Thank you, Thomas, she began. Over the past 3 weeks, a diverse group of residents has worked to address the concerns raised at our special meeting. We've consulted with legal experts, reviewed HOA best practices from across the country, and most importantly, listened to what you, our neighbors, want from this community. She placed a document on the podium. The proposed amendments before you tonight represent a fundamental shift in how Sunnyside Estates operates. They're designed to foster communication over confrontation, mediation over mandates, and community well-being over rigid conformity. The amendments were surprisingly straightforward. Creation of a neighborhood mediation committee to address disputes between residents before formal complaints could be filed. Requirement that all rule violation reports include photographic evidence taken from public spaces only, with explicit prohibition of surveillance activities. Implementation of a 3-strike policy for demonstrably frivolous complaints. Restructuring of all committees to include term limits and mandatory rotation of leadership. Establishment of quarterly town halls for open discussion of community concerns. Clear guidelines for emergency fund expenditures, requiring supermajority board approval for maintaining reserves above a certain percentage. And most significantly, a comprehensive revision of the Community Standards section of the Covenant, focusing on safety and structural integrity rather than aesthetic preferences. Michelle, listening from her seat beside Robert, marveled at how thoroughly the amendments addressed not just the symptoms, but the root causes of Sunnyside's dysfunction. It wasn't just about stopping Pamela Whitfield. It was about creating sustainable systems that prevented anyone from accumulating that kind of unchecked influence again. The floor opened for discussion, and to everyone's surprise, Pamela Whitfield herself approached the microphone. She looked different somehow, still perfectly groomed in pressed slacks and a blouse, but the rigid authority she'd always projected had dimmed. I've lived in Sunnyside Estates for 17 years, she began, her voice less commanding than usual. I moved here after my husband died because the strict covenant promised stability and predictability. I believe I was protecting what made this neighborhood special. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. It's been suggested to me by certain parties that my methods may have been overzealous, that in attempting to maintain standards, I failed to consider the human elements of community. Eleanor, Michelle noticed, was watching Pamela with an inscrutable expression. I still believe in rules and order, Pamela continued. I still believe that common standards benefit everyone, but I recognize that rules should serve the community, not the other way around. She straightened her shoulders. I won't be voting for all of these amendments. Some go too far in my view, but I will be stepping back from community enforcement roles, effective immediately. And she faltered slightly, I apologize to the Jackson family for my actions regarding their children. It was inappropriate. The silence that followed her statement was profound. Michelle felt Robert's hand tighten around hers. She hadn't expected an apology, certainly not a public one. As Pamela returned to her seat, no longer in the front row, but midway back, Eleanor rose and approached her. The two women spoke briefly, their conversation inaudible to the rest of the room. Something passed between them. Not friendship exactly, but perhaps understanding. The vote, when it came, was decisive. 6 of the 7 amendments passed with overwhelming support. Only the section on aesthetic standards received significant opposition, primarily from longtime residents who valued the neighborhood's uniform appearance. Even that passed, though by a narrower margin. As the meeting wrapped up, Thomas made one final announcement. In keeping with our new commitment to community building, I'm pleased to announce that the renovation of the playground will begin next Monday. Additionally, we'll be holding our first Sunnyside Summer Festival on the last weekend of August, featuring games, food trucks, and activities for all ages. He smiled, looking more relaxed than anyone had ever seen him. Sign-up sheets for volunteer committees are in the back. And yes, before anyone asks, chalk art will be an official activity. Laughter rippled through the room, the inside joke already becoming part of neighborhood lore. As people gathered their things, Michelle felt a tentative tap on her shoulder. Pamela Whitfield stood there, her usual confidence notably absent. "Mrs. Jackson," she said stiffly, "I wanted to apologize again directly. What I did it was wrong, regardless of my intentions." Michelle studied the older woman's face, seeing for the first time the loneliness that likely drove much of her behavior. "Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Whitfield. I appreciate it." Pamela nodded, then added, almost reluctantly, "Your children. They seem very happy, very well adjusted." Coming from Pamela, it was practically effusive praise. "They are," Michelle agreed. "They're good kids, just, normal, active 7-year-olds who sometimes need their swimwear adjusted." The ghost of a smile flickered across Pamela's face. "Well, good evening then." As Pamela walked away, Eleanor appeared at Michelle's side. "Progress," she observed quietly. "Small steps, but progress nonetheless." "Did you have something to do with that apology?" Michelle asked. Eleanor's eyes twinkled. "Let's just say that sometimes people need a gentle nudge towards self-reflection, especially people who've spent years judging others without ever turning that critical eye inward." "You're quite something, Judge Rodriguez," Michelle said admiringly. "Eleanor, please. And speaking of reflections, I've been meaning to ask you something. We're forming a proper board nominating committee for the fall elections. We need new perspectives, younger families represented. Would you consider running?" Michelle blinked in surprise. "Me? I've only lived here a few months. I don't know the first thing about running an HOA." "You know more than you think," Eleanor replied. "You know what it's like to be on the receiving end of overzealous enforcement. You know what matters to families with young children. And most importantly, you know how to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." Before Michelle could respond, Robert joined them, the twins in tow. "What did we miss?" he asked. "Eleanor thinks I should run for the HOA board," Michelle said, still processing the suggestion. Robert grinned. From pool confrontation to HOA board in less than a month. That might be a Sunnyside record. Max tugged at Michelle's sleeve. "Mom, can we go to the playground now? Dad said they're going to build a rocket ship there." "Not until next week, buddy," Robert explained. "They have to build it first. If they need design input, I have ideas," Zoe announced seriously. "It should definitely have a secret passage." As Eleanor excused herself to speak with other residents, Michelle looked around the community center, at the clusters of neighbors chatting animatedly, at the sign-up sheets already filling with volunteers, at the palpable sense of ownership and investment that had been missing before. Perhaps this was what community was supposed to feel like, not perfect conformity enforced through surveillance and complaints, but imperfect people working together, making mistakes, apologizing, improving, and creating something better than any one person could envision alone. "You know what?" she said to Robert as they gathered their things to leave. "I think I might run after all." The last weekend of August arrived with the perfect kind of summer weather that real estate brochures promise, but reality rarely delivers. Sunny but not sweltering, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and barbecue smoke. The inaugural Sunnyside Summer Festival transformed the community's central green space. Colorful tents housed everything from face painting to a bake-off judging station. A local band comprising 3 Sunnyside residents and their college-age children set up near the recently renovated playground, which was swarming with delighted kids testing the limits of the promised rocket ship climbing structure, which did, indeed, feature a small hidden tunnel that Zoe claimed personal credit for inspiring. Michelle, clipboard in hand, moved between activity stations with the focused efficiency of someone who discovered an unexpected talent for event coordination. Her welcome committee badge, designed by Max, complete with a wobbly drawing of a house with a smiley face, had become a familiar sight around the neighborhood over the past month. "The snow cone line is getting out of control," Susan Miller reported, wiping sweat from her forehead. "We need another volunteer there ASAP." Michelle consulted her master schedule. Henry Williams should be finishing up at the cornhole tournament. "I'll redirect him." As she navigated through clusters of neighbors, some she now considered friends, others whose names she was still learning, Michelle marveled at how different this felt from her first days in Sunnyside. 3 months ago, she barely made eye contact with other residents, afraid of inadvertently violating some unwritten rule. Now she moved with the confidence of someone who belonged. Robert appeared at her side, balancing 3 paper plates of food. "Lunch delivery for the organizing mastermind," he announced. "The twins are with Dr. Rodriguez at the chalk art competition. She's teaching them about perspective drawing, which I'm pretty sure is going right over their heads, but they're having a blast covering themselves in chalk dust." Michelle accepted a plate gratefully. "Eleanor is full of surprises. Did you know she taught art before going to law school? She's been holding impromptu sketching lessons for the kids all summer." They found a relatively quiet spot under an oak tree to eat. From this vantage point, Michelle could see most of the festival, the newly refurbished playground teeming with children, teenagers manning the face-painting booth with surprising dedication, older residents judging the baking contest with comical seriousness, young couples pushing strollers or chasing toddlers across the lawn. And there, on the periphery, was Pamela Whitfield. She wasn't participating in any activities, but she wasn't documenting infractions either. She simply sat on a bench, watching the proceedings with an expression Michelle couldn't quite decipher, not quite approval, but not the judgment she would have expected. As if sensing Michelle's gaze, Pamela looked in their direction. After a moment's hesitation, she offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Michelle nodded back, surprised to feel not resentment but something closer to pity mixed with cautious respect. It couldn't be easy to see a community you thought you were protecting embrace a vision so different from your own. Earth to Michelle. Robert's voice broke through her thoughts. "You've got that strategic planning look again." She smiled, refocusing on her husband. "Sorry, just taking it all in. It's pretty amazing what's happened in a few weeks, isn't it? From police at the pool to community festival, with a side of HOA revolution." He grinned. Not bad for a summer project. Thomas Berry approached their shade spot, looking more relaxed in jeans and a polo shirt than Michelle had ever seen him. "The festival's a huge success," he reported, lowering himself onto the grass beside them. "The board just had an impromptu meeting, and we're already talking about making it an annual tradition." "Speaking of the board," Robert prompted, giving Michelle a meaningful look. She shot him a playful glare before turning to Thomas. "I've been thinking about Eleanor's suggestion, about running in the fall election." Thomas nodded encouragingly. "We could use your perspective, and after seeing how you organize this event, I'd say you've got the skills for it." I'm still new here, Michelle hedged, though she'd been warming to the idea more each day. There must be others with more experience, more knowledge of the neighborhood history. That's exactly why we need you, Thomas said firmly. Too much "that's how we've always done it" thinking is what got us into trouble in the first place. Besides, he added with a wry smile, you've already faced down our most formidable resident and lived to tell the tale. Board meetings will be a breeze after that. Before Michelle could respond, Max and Zoe barreled toward them, their faces, arms, and shirts covered in multicolored chalk dust. Mom, Dad, we won, Zoe exclaimed, waving a blue ribbon. Well, we tied for first place, Max clarified with characteristic precision, with the Rodriguez grandkids. Our chalk mural was the biggest. It's a cooperative community effort, Eleanor explained, approaching at a more dignified pace behind the children. They work together instead of competing. I thought that deserved recognition. Looking at her chalk-covered children, happy, confident, and unworried about breaking arbitrary rules, Michelle felt the last piece of her decision slide into place. I'm going to do it, she told Robert later that evening as they sat on their back patio watching fireflies rise from the lawn. The twins had crashed into bed without protest, exhausted from a day of play and sun. I'm going to run for the board. I know, he said simply. You know? How could you know when I just decided? He smiled. Because I know you. And I saw your face when those kids from Oak Ridge Apartments came to the festival after Eleanor invited the neighboring communities. You were already thinking about how to make next year's event more inclusive before this one was even over. He was right. Michelle had been thinking beyond Sunnyside, about how their little revolution might extend to other communities, other neighborhoods where arbitrary rules and overzealous enforcement created tension instead of connection. It's going to be a lot of work, she acknowledged, and not everyone will agree with the changes. That's community for you, Robert replied. Messy, imperfect, sometimes frustrating, but worth the effort. In the months that followed, Sunnyside Estates continued its transformation. Michelle won her board seat in a landslide. The revised covenant was officially adopted. Eleanor's Neighborhood Mediation Committee successfully resolved a dozen potential conflicts before they escalated to formal complaints. The playground became a genuine gathering place, with parents lingering to chat while children played. Lock parties replaced violation notices as the primary form of neighborhood communication. Even Pamela gradually found a new niche, applying her meticulous attention to detail to the community garden project where her expertise in rose cultivation proved genuinely valuable. Not everything changed overnight. There were still disagreements about holiday decorations, parking procedures, and appropriate fence heights, but now there were systems for addressing concerns that didn't involve surveillance or shame, systems that recognized the humanity behind housing regulations. 1 year after the pool incident, as it was still sometimes called, though increasingly with laughter rather than tension, the Jacksons hosted a small gathering in their backyard to celebrate their anniversary in the neighborhood. Susan and Greg were there with their children. The Paddles brought samosas. Henry Williams showcased the birdhouses his youth carpentry group had built. Eleanor came with her signature chocolate eclairs. As evening fell and the adults chatted while the children played an elaborate game involving water balloons and an obstacle course, Michelle found herself standing beside Eleanor near the garden gate. Did you ever imagine this would be the outcome when you stepped in that day at the pool? Michelle asked. Eleanor smiled, the wisdom of her years evident in the gentle lines around her eyes. Communities are living things, she said thoughtfully. Sometimes they need a catalyst, a moment that forces everyone to look at what they've allowed to become normal and ask if it's really what they want. She gestured toward the yard, where neighbors who had once been strangers now laughed and talked like old friends. The real credit goes to you and Robert. You could have retreated, avoided the pool, kept to yourselves. Instead, you turned an embarrassing moment into a movement. Michelle shook her head. We just wanted our kids to be able to swim without being surveilled. All this, she waved her hand at the gathering, this was a community effort. And that, Eleanor said with satisfaction, is precisely the point. Later, after the guests had gone and the twins were asleep upstairs, Michelle and Robert sat on their patio furniture, tired but content. "Remember when we were so worried about buying in an HOA neighborhood?" Robert mused. "You said it would be all about conformity and rules." "And you said it would protect our property values," Michelle countered, poking his arm playfully. "I guess we were both right, in a way," he reflected. "But we never expected that our kids' wardrobe malfunction would lead to community transformation." Michelle laughed. "Definitely not what I expected when I signed those mortgage papers. But you know what? I wouldn't change a thing." She looked up at the stars visible above their little piece of suburban paradise. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked briefly. A car door closed. The normal, unremarkable sounds of community life continued around them. Not perfectly regulated, not completely uniform, but comfortably, authentically human. And in Sunnyside Estates, that had become the new normal.